Hello everyone and welcome to the Age Group Triathlon Podcast. My name is Simon Olney, I'm a professional triathlon coach, and in this week's episode we have part 2 of my series on how to go from being an occasional bike rider to a confident road cyclist. Now if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I recommend you go back in the episode history and you dig that one out, where I look at different kinds of bikes, different kinds of frame material and the basic accessories that you need to purchase alongside the bike to get it up and running. In this week's episode, I'm going to be covering stuff that is a bit more technical. I'm going to be covering stuff that is more to do with the moving parts of the bike and helping you understand all the jargon. Talking about cassettes and group sets and different kinds of brakes and shifting, all those little bits like that, which you do need to understand. The last thing that I want you to do as a triathlete, especially if you are going to be taking on, longer races, which take a long time to go out and train for, is to jump onto this bike and think to yourself, I just hope to God that nothing breaks. Because I don't really understand anything about this bike. I just know that I pedal it to go forwards, I brake and I drop it off at the bike shop every now and then and they fix things on it for me. I want you to understand your bike in detail to put you in the strongest position out there, so that you feel confident that, any minor issues you can solve yourself. Getting stuck straight in. The word group set gets bandied about a lot in cycling. And I wanted to break down what it was and why it is so important, because the group set is probably more important than the weight of the bike in some cases. Now, for triathletes, I wouldn't say it's necessarily the case. But if you're shopping at road bikes, the price point is going to be very much dictated by the group set that is on the bike. So what is a group set and why is it important? The group set is a term that's used to refer to anything that is sort of mechanical, moving parts, anything like that. So we're talking about everything to do with your gears, your shifters, your brakes, the bottom bracket, which is the piece that sits between your cranks, runs through your frame. It's a very cheap, basic part of the bike, but it is essential. It's the chain. It's all of these areas. Anything that is metal and that moves is most likely going to be part of your group set. And having a really top-end group set relative to an extremely basic group set is going to make a real difference to your cycling. Because if you have a very basic group set that, for the sake of argument, only has 6 or 7 gears, when we look at a top end that could have 12 or maybe even 13 in some rare cases, this is a huge disparity. It's a gaping chasm, because the cyclist who only has 7 gears, they're going to find themselves 6 or 7 gears, that it's going to be difficult to find a gear that's just right for the hill that they're on. It's going to be too hard or it's going to be too easy. And on a cheap group set, when you change gears, it's going to be really clunky. It's going to be really slow. It's going to, you're going to miss shifts occasionally. It's going to not be very well designed, so it's going to wear quite quickly. When you change gears, then the shifter, it just isn't, it's going to be thrown out of whack easier, the materials will bend easier. There are a number of reasons that you really don't want to go for a cheaper group set. Now, you'd be probably hard pressed to find a bike that that has sort of less than 8 gears these days, because the technology has just come on. It's a lot more affordable now. But if you are just getting your old bike out of the shed that you got from sort of 10 years ago, then there is a good chance that this will be the case. What determines the number of gears that we have is something called our cassette, or the gear sprocket as some people might call it. This sits on our rear wheel, assuming that you don't have a single speed bike. There will be on the back of your bike, and there will be a number of different sort of sprockets of different gears on the back that you will make your way through. And we have to consider a number of things with the cassette, which is, the number of gears that it has. And I should point out at this point, you can't buy yourself a new cassette that is, say, a 12-speed cassette and expect to then get 12 gears, because that's not how that's going to work. Because the The shifter itself will be connected to your cassette. And when you shift a gear, it is going to only have so many sort of ways that it can move. It can only make so many shifts. So a shifter on a 6-speed bike is only going to be able to shift gears 6 times. And you can't simply say, oh, well, I'll get a... if, say, between like an 11 and a 12-speed cassette, you can't say, oh, well, I can't find the right 11-speed cassette, so I'll just get a 12 one and not have that extra gear, because it's also to do with the spacing between the gears and the width of the chain. These all are going to impact the number of gears that you can have. And by the way, as I am talking about these concepts, if you don't understand something that I've just said, I recommend that you go back, rewind your podcast 30 seconds and listen to it again until you actually really get your head around it. Because unless you understand the basics that I'm discussing now, when things get a bit more involved, then you may find yourself really lost at sea. But the cassette, the one that you're looking for, is going to depend on making sure that it matches the gears on your bike. So if you have a 12-speed bike, you need to make sure that you get a 12-speed cassette. You may say to yourself, well, Simon, I don't even know how many gears my bike has. In that case, all you need to do is you need to count the number of gears on that cassette. So simply with your finger, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Oh, it must be a 12-speed bike. If you've bought your bike second-hand and it's really clunky, there is a possibility that someone has got, say, an 11-speed bike and put a 12-speed cassette on it. To work that out, you just simply need to make shifts with the shifter and see how many shifts it is that you can make before it sort of goes clunk and goes, I've got nothing else here. And that in itself is sort of the biggest part of the cassette. But where, as a number of experienced cyclists will have a number of cassettes, is due to your gearing. And the gearing is important because it helps us understand sort of how our bike is going to perform on the hills. And by changing our gearing, this can really revolutionize our cycling experience. Now, the first thing we need to consider when we're looking at this is the size of our biggest cog and our smallest cog on our cassette. The biggest cog determines your easiest gear. So this is the gear that you'll be using when you are climbing up the hills. So you kind of have to think about it in reverse engineering, because some people may think, well, hang on, that biggest gear, that's going to be for when I'm going the fastest, but it's actually for when you're going the slowest and up the steepest terrain. So you might need to rewire your brain a little bit there. But this rear cog, it can be anywhere on road bikes, generally speaking. Mountain bikes are different. Can have anywhere from around about 23 in extreme cases, all the way up to 34 teeth on it. Okay, there will be some bikes, gravel bikes, mountain bikes might have even more. Might be getting into sort of the 40s and maybe even the 50s in some cases. But for road cycling, we don't tend to go up much in the way of horrifically steep inclines. So we will be looking at around about sort of maxing out around about that sort of 32, 34 in most cases, but there will be exceptions. Now, if you have a 23 on the back, so nearly all road bikes these days, they have 11 teeth on the smallest cog. That's pretty standard. And somebody has, say, 23 on the back, so that would be an 1123 is what we call it. It's got 11 on the smallest cog and it's got 23 on the largest. Now, an 1123, it would be designed for time trialing, for racing on very flat, very fast pieces of road. You really wouldn't want to go up anything but the gentlest of hills with one of these, because a 23 on the back is going to make hill climbing very difficult. Now, you could ask yourself, why would anyone choose to make the hills harder for them? Why would they run a cassette like that makes it so hard to ride up a hill? The reason is that when you have a very narrow cassette like that, the changes between each gear are really small. So if I was doing a pan flat time trial, there's a course around here near me that is absolutely pan flat. I'm not going to be needing those larger gears, okay? I'm going to be wanting to go as fast as I can. And whenever I change gear, I get just a slight increase or decrease in difficulty, which allows me to find that sweet spot really nicely. Because if it does kick up just a little bit by, say, 0.5%, and I feel that I'm no longer in sort of the cadence range that I want to be, and I don't want to have to like get out the saddle to sort of to wind things up and to get myself back to where I need to be, I can just change down a gear and it just makes a very slight difference. Now, if we were to go for something more extreme, such as say like an 1134, which again is sort of probably the largest cassette that you'll find on the road, then the gaps between those gears are going to be more noticeable. And you can find yourself in a place where this one gear feels too easy, your legs are spinning too fast. So you change gear and it feels a bit too slow, that your legs feel they're working a little bit too hard. You can't quite find that sweet spot. But the benefit of this is, the reason that I recommend most newer cyclists go for a nice big wide cassette, is that it makes it so much easier going up hills. If you can swap out, because most bikes, road bikes, when you buy them, will probably come with an 1128. That's standard. That's about average of what it is that you're looking for. When you buy a bike, because it does a bit of both, right? But if you're taking on a hilly event, you live in a hilly area, or hills just scare you, then upgrading your cassette to have a wider spread of gears on it, even if again you're a new cyclist, or maybe you're an older cyclist, somebody just getting into cycling later in life, where we do lose muscle mass over the years. If you want to go for a wider cassette, I absolutely recommend that you do so. I coached an athlete, Ironman Wales once, and a few weeks out, we had a chat about gearing, and he was running a 28, and I said realistically, I think you should be looking at running like a 30, a 32, because of how hilly that course is. And so he got that change on his bike, and he had a couple of weeks practice riding with that. And at the end of the day, but due to various reasons, with the time that he had available to train with a young daughter, he only just made it round the bike course. I think he had about sort of 15 minutes to spare on the cut-off, so he was cutting it really quite fine. And he said to me afterwards, like, I don't think I could have got over those hills with my old setup. So it can be really impactful, it can be really important. And there can be this sense of bravado when you chat to some road cyclists who will poo-poo anyone who rides anything larger than a 25. Don't listen to these people. There is no valid reason for this other than grandstanding and showing off and pretending to be the big man who is, out there riding 11.25 up the steep climbs. Like, we're triathletes, we're better than that. Not that I'm sort of looking down at road cyclists, but we should be looking at things through a pragmatic lens, going, well, we have a run after this, and we can't afford to mash our legs to pieces on the bikes out of a misplaced sense of pride, because we don't want to be seen to have a big cassette on the back. We're not about style, we're about substance. Now, you can remove the cassette. It is a job that you could do at home by getting yourself a cassette tool and a chain whip. It's not the hardest job in the world. The issue is, obviously you have to purchase the tools, but if you want to get into the sport, if you love the idea of the sport of triathlon, this isn't a large investment to make. It can save you quite a bit. But the downside is, if you are upgrading your cassette, then you may need to get yourself a larger rear derailleur or rear mech. Because the way that the chain runs, when you start putting that bigger gear on, you will need a new chain as well, I should say, because the chain is going to be longer. You may end up needing a larger rear derailleur. Again, I recommend in this situation, you go to your local bike shop and you say to them, this is the bike that I've got, this is the rear derailleur I have. I'm looking to upgrade my cassette to a wider one. What can I get away with? When am I going to need to step up to a larger rear mech? And, they'll be able to help you pick out the right kind of cassette that's going to work for you and your bike. I recommend, broadly speaking, against mixing and matching any components between manufacturers. So if you have a Shimano sort of group set shifters, but you think, oh, I found this nice cheap SRAM cassette, it may not work especially well. I know that between Shimano and SRAM there are some cross compatibilities, but Campagnolo and other group set manufacturers, I don't believe there is any crossover. So just keep life simpler for yourself. Spend the extra sort of nominal amount and get one that's going to work for you. But going to a bike shop, consulting them, ordering it through them, because you're not a dick. If you're getting their advice, ordering it through them, and if you can install it at home, that's great. But if you are going to install a new rear derailleur, that is going to involve, not only reattaching the derailleur to the bike itself, it's going to mean the cables, it's going to mean re-indexing, assuming that you're running mechanical, it's going to mean re-indexing. It's a bit of a faff, sort of creating a chain, splitting the chain, making sure it's the right length, rebuilding it. I have on more than one occasion, and I consider myself to be reasonable at being a bike mechanic. I have more than once sort of made a chain that is too short, and I've had to throw it away and buy a new one. So it can be a bit of a job upgrading your rear derailleur. So if you are, very new to cycling, definitely book that one into the shop, unless you're mechanically minded and you really want to learn. Now, that sums up just about everything that I need to tell you about the cassette. Now, while I'm here chatting about this, I feel I should touch on the other reason that people will look to buy an advanced group set rather than just the number of gears and how responsive the gear shifts are. And the reason for that is weight. If you were to get a really cheap cassette and a really expensive cassette, the expensive cassette is going to be lighter. If you put them both in your hands, if you get like a 7-speed cassette and a 10-speed cassette, you would be able to tell the difference. You go, oh yeah, crikey, yeah, I can feel how much lighter this 10-speed one is, and it will also be more durable, I'm pretty sure. So you do get that improvement in durability, you get that improvement in the weight, but we have to give ourselves a reality check here, and we need to look at the weight difference between different group sets. So if we are to look at the weight of each combined group set. So this, as an example, it's the current 12-speed Di2 disc group sets, because the group sets are going to be different based on mechanical or electronic, which you're going to get to later, and they're also going to vary depending on whether they're disc brake or whether they're rim brake. There are quite a number of different things taken into consideration. But if we look at the 105, Shimano 105, at the moment, that comes in at a grand total of 2,950 grams. So just under 3 kilos for all of the working parts on your bike, which is quite light. The frame itself can often be really quite light, but the components themselves and the wheels can be what weigh things down. So don't get too drawn into these frames that you can lift up with your little finger in the bike shop when they're trying to grandstand and show off, because you do have to bolt these on. If you are looking to go for Shimano Ultegra, you instead would be looking at 2,577 grams total. Okay, this is based on crank length, and different cassettes weigh different amounts. This is just a very simple table that I've managed to find. But at the end of the day, you're looking at around about 600 grams more if we opt for 105 over Ultegra. So if you were to buy a bike with Ultegra on it, it would end up being about 600 grams lighter. And from there we can then look at Shimano Dura Ace, which is around about 2,058 grams total. So we're looking again at around about 600 grams less. So it's 1 kilogram lighter than 105. Now the price, of course, is going to come into this. So if we're looking at, if we want to say upgrade our group set. Now, the majority of cases, upgrading your group set is a little bit of a false economy. Because unless you have a very nice, expensive bike frame, the chances are that you could probably get yourself a bike for not much more than for upgrading a group set. So If we have a look at the Shimano 105 to start with, depending on the variation you're going for, again, there's disc version, there's electronic version, there's hydraulics, there's lots of different options, but you'd be looking at somewhere between £500 and £930 for a new 105 group set. So that's a lot of money, isn't it? I know there are some people here who will balk at spending £1,000 on a bike, but spending the best part of £1,000 just on the group set, just on the moving parts, could be hard for them to get their head around, which is why when you are shopping for a bike, you want to make sure that you are looking to spend money there rather than thinking, oh, I'll upgrade that further down the line. Really think through this. Next up, we have Ultegra. Now remember, Ultegra is 600 grams lighter, give or take. We're looking at between 1,400 or 2,400 for Ultegra. Yeah, that's about £1,500 more potentially between the top end of 105 and Ultegra. And for that money, you get marginally better shifting and you save 600 grams. And then we can look at Dura Ace, which is sometimes known as the dentist's group set, as they're the only people who can afford it. £2,400 to £3,900 for a Dura Ace group set. Yes, nearly £4,000 if you want the very top of the line group set, which I imagine will be a disc brake group set, hydraulic brakes, and Di2. That is electric shifting. Okay, don't get me wrong, it would be absolutely lovely to ride, but it's £4,000. Come on. Like the thought of going down to the bike shop and waving my credit card and going £4,000 on that, please, when it's not actually an entirely new bike, is obscene to me. So if you think that you want to upgrade your group set, I mean, there's a bit of a trap that you can fall into where if you end up with a shifter that fails, these are quite expensive to replace. You can be looking at £150 in some cases, even sort of like a 105 shifter to get yourself that new shifter if there's part of the mechanism that gives out and they're not able to repair it and it's out of warranty. They get a lot of wear, these things. You do need to look after them. You can say, well, I just it makes me feel sick, the thought of spending £150 on a shifter. I get an entirely new group set for £500. If I just bite the bullet, I get an entirely new group set. It's going to feel like riding a new bike again. And you can then find yourself, well, what are you looking at for a new bike these days? And before you know it, your shifter's broken, you're browsing new bikes. There is like a knock-on effect. There is a snowball effect with this. Now, for triathletes, upgrading your group set really isn't money well spent. If you are a road cyclist who is trying to win a prestigious event that finishes on a long steep climb where you need to save every gram that you can and you want to make sure that every gear shift is as crisp and instant as possible to make sure that you can follow people's attacks, you can attack yourself up the climb, then yeah, there is obviously mileage in this, but you'll probably be sponsored at that if you're at that level. For most mortals, Shimano 105 is all you need. You can go cheaper. You can go for Tiagra. Claris itself is a relatively budget group set, to be said, and you will notice the difference. But if there is a choice between Ultegra and 105, unless you can get the Ultegra bike isn't that much cheaper, you can stick with the 105. Don't worry about it. Talking about the weight of the cassette obviously took me down that little rabbit hole there. I'm going to continue on the theme of our gearing, and I'm going to be looking at the chain set. Now, the chain set is a catch-all term for that big plate at the front of your bike that your right-hand pedal is attached to. So that is It's in most cases it has two chain rings attached to it, and it is also attached to the cranks, and it is they attach through the bottom bracket. Now, when you are sort of starting out cycling, the chances are you will have something known as a compact chain set. The compact chain set came around when they decided, due to advancements in technology, that rather than have 3 blocks of gears at the front, they could get away with having 2 with modern gearing, which means that you spend less time shifting between your chain rings at the front. So a compact has a 50-tooth outer ring and a 34-tooth inner ring. Now, when you're in the small ring, that will make things easier for you, which can be, again, a bit hard to get your head around, because people may think, well, hang on, but the larger gear at the back is for the hills, but the smaller gear at the front is for the hills? Yeah, that's just the way it works. If you try to spin the spokes of your bike around using your finger and keep it really close to the hub of the wheel, and then try spinning that wheel around when with the spokes when your finger is up high by the rim, that's going to make a massive difference. You'll start to understand. But your small ring at the front is for the hills, and it comes with a 34. Mostly when you buy a bike, I'd be very surprised if you buy a road bike and it did not come with a compact 3450. But if you are taking on something that is really hilly, a really challenging course, you may want to consider getting a smaller chainring. Now, getting a smaller chainring, it's not overly expensive, but it is a bit fiddly, and you really want to make sure you know what you're doing, because there's some issues with sort of the compatibility of the gear ratios and the chain and the cassette. It does get a little bit murky. But if you are somebody who really needs as much help as they can get on the climbs, and you've changed to a nice big cassette on the back, but you're still struggling, you can consider changing your front chainring, but that should be the bit of a last resort, really. Now, you can get people who will ride larger sort of chain rings on the front. They'll be running a standard, which I believe goes up, it can be sort of a 52 or a 54 on that front chain ring. And the reason for that is that when somebody is riding downhill, when they're in the big ring, they're more likely to be able to get purchase. If you have your front chainring at your big chainring at the front, is smaller, then you're going to run out of gears on the downhills. Whereas if your big chainring on the front is larger, you'll be able to keep pedaling, keep pushing power downhill, and extend your advantage on the downhills. But on the hills, on the climbs, when generally riding around, it can end up being a bit of a liability. And there are certain people who maybe have come from a sort of a strength sport background, spent a lot of time in the gym, got really strong legs, who may benefit from having this. Or some cyclists who they just train to be absolute power mongers. Sometimes people who specialise in time trials, sort of shorter time trials, at up to the 40k mark, they may go for a nice big chainring at the front on their TT bike, because they know that they are going to want to be pushing as much as they can. And on my triathlon bike downstairs, it's a 2017 model. It has a standard on it, and it has got me into trouble in some hilly triathlons before. So you do need to ensure that you are sort of using the right chainring for the job, but focus on the cassette first. If you're having gearing issues, look at the cassette. The chain set, we can fiddle with it, we can change it, but I do think that should be more of a last resort, because the cassette is just so much easier to swap things in and out. Now, to actually shift the gears themselves, you're going to need the shifters, which sit on the front of the bike, which are the acronym for them is very unfortunate: Shimano Total Integration STI. You've got to make sure you look after your STIs. These allow you to change gear and to brake, having access to both of them at the front of the bike. In years gone by, before these, You would have your shifters would partway down your down tube on your bike, so they'd be around where your knees are, and you'd have to reach down every time that you wanted to change gear, which pretty frustrating really. So these days shifters are going to be at our handlebars with these shifters on our bike, and these are going to be what's known as index, so that every time that you change the gear it moves by a set amount. Again, in years gone by with the older shifters, they were known as friction shifters, where you didn't get the satisfying clunk, clunk, clunk every time you change gear. That lever was continuous, and there was very little resistance on it. And what you had to do is you had to just slowly move the shifter along until you felt it engage the next gear, and then maybe the gear after that, and the gear after that. And if you didn't get it right, it could try like jumping between gears, so they could be very finicky. But these days, with modern technology, we can shift our bike, and we know that it's going to shift by the exact increment we have asked it to every single time. There is an issue, however, when we end up with the cables not doing what they're supposed to be doing, or the derailleurs themselves end up being knocked. And this is quite common. If you chuck your bike in the back of your car, and the rear shifter, or when you're packing your bike in a box, and the rear shifter gets knocked a little bit, then you go from having these super crisp shifts to them being a bit sort of rattly, and there being some delay with them. And chances are the derailleur has either been knocked out of place, or in some cases might have even been bent. And you need to then do what's known as indexing your gears. Now, indexing your gears is a simple job in many ways, but it's also very frustrating. So you'll have a barrel adjuster that will be either at the gear shifter itself or down by the rear mech. And as you change this barrel adjuster, as you twist this barrel adjuster, it will make the tension in the cable looser or tighter. And if the cable ends up becoming loose, or the shifter gets knocked, you can end up losing access to your easiest gear or your hardest gear, or the shifts between them just become more frustrating. They become slower. And it's quite common in these situations for people to get really frustrated. Oh, my bike's broken. Can't believe it. And they will, in some cases, even look at getting a new bike, some people, because they think that this one's broken and they need a new one, when the reality is all it would take would be a quarter of a turn with that barrel adjuster, and that would put the gears back right next to where they need to be. Now, I'm not going to try and talk you through indexing your gears on a podcast. That'd be an exercise in frustration. But if you stick into YouTube, how to index bicycle gears, how to index rear mech, how to index front mech, that is really going to help. Now, as well as your index screws, not the index screws, the barrel adjuster, you also have limit screws that are on the derailleurs themselves. I recommend, if you're listening to this and you're new to cycling, don't touch those screws, because what those screws do is they stop the chain from falling off of the derailleur or the chainring. So if you were shifting into your small ring, shifting down into your small ring, and the limit screws weren't quite right, your chain would fall off of the cassette, it would fall off of the gearing ratio, and it would end up just being wrapped around your bike frame, which could in some cases result in a crash. Same if you're shifting up your cassette into your big ring, it could actually fall off of that big ring and end up getting jammed between your spokes and your cassette, which very likely to cause a crash. Now, when it comes to your gears at the front, it is less likely that you're going to end up putting yourself in danger in the same way if your chain ends up dropping off, because it's quite a common occurrence, is that somebody will shift gears into the small ring or the big ring, and that chain will fall off. So it will either fall, most commonly, to the inside. So you'll be shifting from your big ring to your small ring, and it will miss the small ring, and the chain will land in the in sort of the gap between the sort of the chain rings and the frame itself, and your legs will suddenly start pedaling really quickly with zero resistance. You have to pull over. The lesser seen version is when you shift into your larger gear and the chain misses the large gear and ends up being wrapped around your crank arm. Which again is going to feel horrible. You'll have to pull over and fix it, and this is known as a dropped chain. Now I'm going to go through basic mechanical fixes later on in the episode, but I don't really want to get sidetracked at this point. Now, the limit screws will help prevent that from happening. You've got a high limit screw and a low limit screw. Again, I'm not going to try and tell you how to do this job via audio, but the rear one I would probably leave alone, to be honest. But the front one, if you are repeatedly dropping your chain, it may just be that a couple of twists of the screw are all that it needs. But I recommend against, you're not going to need to adjust the screw by more than half a turn. And always remember where you started. Take a photo of where it was when it started. Maybe put a little bit of, just a dab of Tipp-Ex or paint onto one bit so you can see how it lined up when you started, because you want to at the very least be able to go back to where you are, because many times I've gone to fix my bike and ended up making it worse. So always take a photo to remind yourself where you started. And yes, as a mechanic, sometimes you will make things worse before you make them better. This is all a learning process, but it just helps to go back, know how to get back to where you started so you can go and ride the damn thing the next day. Now at this point, I want to talk about electronic shifting. So if you get a electronic shifting group set, what happens is when you sort of look at your shifters, instead of them being sort of mechanical with cables that run down to the shifters in question, they are a series of buttons on the shifters. And you press that shifter and it will either send electronic signal through a cable or it will send it wirelessly to your shifter and tell it exactly how far to move. And this is, generally speaking, faster and more reliable than using a mechanical group set. In addition, because the cables are less likely to get knocked, people talk about cable stretching, but when you look at the actual force that has to be applied to a cable for it to stretch, I'm not convinced that's actually what's happening myself. But whereas you will have to index gears and keeping on top of the cables and the cable maintenance, re-lubricating them sometimes with manual, your regular standard shifting, mechanical shifting. With wireless shifting, you remove the cables from the equation completely. And as long as the mech is situated where it's supposed to be, you will have flawless shifting forever. It's fit and forget, which is really quite appealing, especially as someone who has spent countless hours wrestling with cables, trying to get the tension right to be able to get into my big ring again on the front. Now, this can sound like a bit of a miracle solution, but it's not. There are downsides to it. Firstly, is that it can end up being a bit heavier than cables, again, depending on the system, but especially if you have a wireless system, which has a transmitter and a receiver that both require batteries. If you have 4 batteries on your bike, that is going to work out being heavier than 2 cables, let's be honest. But the weight penalty, it really isn't very substantial at all. When you consider, the actual difference that will make adding on a few grams, with triathletes, we're mainly racing on the flats. Okay, wireless shifting, you will see nearly all of the top riders using wireless shifting because it is just so much more convenient. Now, it's a lot more expensive, it has to be said, but the price is coming down relative to where it was sort of 10 years ago when it was very much more a new technology. Another downside you need to consider is keeping your gears charged. It's yet another thing to have to think about keeping charged up. If you have power meter pedals, if you have electronic shifting, then you do need to make sure you monitor the battery levels on these. You've also got your cycle computer, maybe your watch. It's just another thing to have to keep on top of. I know that some people, they've been riding mechanical shifting for years and they think, I just don't want another electronic device in my life. I'm going to stick to what I know. Fair enough. I'm never going to tell someone they should use mechanical or they should use electronic. It really comes down to somebody's budget and somebody's personal preferences. You also have the very unlikely scenario where your gears just sort of pack up on you. Now, it's a relative staple of a triathlon race day for a shout to go out over the transition area, over the PA. Has anyone got a Di2 charger? Because we have an athlete whose gears have run out of battery. And normally this is the athlete's fault, they didn't charge their gears. And it just so happens that they give up on race day. Now, no matter how much you ride your bike, you shouldn't need to charge them more than once a month. So if you just set a reminder on the first of every month to charge your gears, you should be absolutely fine. Same goes for power pedals. But I've had a client recently had an issue with his shifting just not working, and his bike spent about a month in the shop while they tried to fix it. And they tell you, right, there we go, we fixed it, send him off with the bike, and it would break. Again, like the gears would work and then they'd stop working. And it took them so long to work out what the actual problem was. He had to rent a bike for one of his races. It was all a bit of a nightmare. So you can't go into thinking that, the electronic group set is hassle-free and it's completely fit and forget and it's going to solve all your problems. It can be a bit of a nightmare. It can be a bit of a pig in its own right. Now, before we move on to the nuts and bolts of maintenance itself, I wanted to touch on two more topics which people sort of tend to discuss, which is rim brakes versus disc brakes and tubeless versus clinchers when it comes to tyres. So let's kick off by talking about disc brakes versus rim brakes. This is something that divides a lot of opinion in the road cycling world because, as I've touched on previously, a lot of road cyclists are very traditionalists. And they will think, I raced on rim brakes for decades. I don't need any disc brakes. It's all nonsense. The bike industry is just going to sell us new bikes. And yeah, the fact is, people have been riding rim brakes, including myself, for a very, 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 very long time. And they've been fine. But the main issue that you get with rim brakes is that they don't work so well in the wet. And if you are trying to brake when the conditions are wet, the first couple of rotations that the wheel makes after you begin the braking action don't actually brake, they're just clearing the water off of the rim. And then the brake pads will bite, but even then they're going to be less effective. And if you are sort of heading down a hill in the wet, and you try to slam on your anchors because a car pulls out on you or something like that, rim brakes can leave you liable to not being able to stop in time. There's no way of getting around that. And another downside with rim brakes is that every time that you brake, you are wearing away at your wheel, at your rim. And if you ride for long enough, you're going to need to replace your wheel. Now, some could argue that by the time that you put on enough mileage into your wheels that you manage to wear them down with the brake pads, it's probably time for new rims anyway. I mean, it could be, it depends on the conditions that you ride in. Because if you are riding in the rain, if you are riding when there is dirt and grit and grease on the road, if you get a piece of grit that is caught in your wheel or your brake pad, then you're going to start really wearing down those rims an awful lot faster than if you're just braking in the dry. And it's a lot more expensive to buy a new wheel than it is to buy yourself a new disc brake rotor. Another issue, of course, with rim brakes is that when you are descending down a sort of a long descent, so down a mountain, generally speaking, your rims are going to overheat much faster than a disc brake rotor will, which means that you're more likely to encounter brake fade. Now, brake fade is the very scary phenomenon of when you go to brake and your levers travel long. Feels like you're applying all your brake, but you're not actually slowing. That's because your brakes have overheated and they are no longer working. This happens on bicycles, this happens with HGVs. I know that in many parts of the world they have escape lanes on steep downhills, where if somebody's brakes overheat, then they can go straight ahead at this escape lane, where they will come to a controlled stop, because brake overheating is so common on these long descents, where somebody might be braking a fair bit. Now, for us, as cyclists, there's no way we can completely eliminate brake fade. We can do our best by not braking unnecessarily. So if you are going down a mountain, don't ride your brakes all the way down, creating all of that friction and generating heat in your rims. That is a recipe for not quite disaster, but it's not a recipe for success if you want to avoid brake fade. But by switching to disc brakes, these will cool an awful lot quicker, and many of them, you can get them in different sizes as well, so you can get larger disc brakes that will cool quicker. They can be used materials, and they can be constructed in such a way that they cool down quicker. So there's a lot that could be done there, whereas rim brakes, it is just the rim on your bike, and there's not a lot of control that we have over that. But it has to be said, for the most part, rim brakes are cheaper and less hassle than disc brakes. But this, it has to be said, doesn't change the fact that nearly every road bike that you'll be able to buy new in 2026 and likely beyond is probably going to come with disc brakes. They have become the industry standard. The benefits, as I've touched on, much improved braking performance in the wet. Off-road cyclists, gravel and mountain bike have all been using disc brakes non-stop for decades. Okay, it is an established technology. They're just so much better at stopping you when you're riding, especially in sort of wet and, in the case of mountain biking, muddy conditions. It is just better. There's no way of getting around that. You also get less chance of brake fade. You've got a selection of disc rotors that you can choose from. You can swap out a disc rotor instead of having to change a wheel whenever it wears out, which is a massive bonus, has to be said. Now, something I haven't touched on is something called modulation. Now, there are two types of disc brakes. You have cable-operated disc brakes and you have hydraulic disc brakes. If you have a bit of cash, which, let's be honest, if you're looking at triathlon, you've probably got a bit of money, if maybe not loads. You're looking at a sport that includes swimming, cycling and running. There are costs involved. If you have a bit of money to spend, don't get a cable operated disc brake. These really are pretty subpar, it has to be said. They are sort of, I've had some people explain as being the worst of both worlds. Of course, you do have the braking performance that comes with having the disc as opposed to being on the rim. It doesn't wear it down, but the way the cable travels and everything involved with it, the fact that also they do tend to be the cheapest rotors and brakes that come with it, they're just not great. Whereas hydraulic disc brakes are a joy to use. Now, hydraulic disc brakes work by having a sort of a braking fluid inside a hydraulic hose. Well, it's a hydraulic fluid, I suppose, really. And whenever you squeeze the brake levers, you create that pressure, and that engages the brake caliper, which then squeezes the rotors. So as a result, you have much greater control, because rim brakes, they tend to be a little bit, they're off or they're on. But a combination of the way the brakes work, as well as the levers and that. There's a reason that so many people end up locking up rear wheels or flying over their handlebars by locking up their front wheel. And that's because it's easy to grab a handful of brake accidentally. Whereas with disc brakes, you have much more control over how much brake it is that you're applying, which makes going over the handlebars or going into a skid because you locked up your rear wheel much less likely. So this is an absolutely, a massive bonus. It does feel, there's just something that's so nice about using hydraulic disc brakes. I appreciate that they are, they do come on bikes that are a little bit punchier, a little bit more expensive. But they really are money well spent relative to cable-operated disc brakes. The next thing I wanted to look at was clinchers versus tubeless. Now, a clincher tyre is a tyre which has an inner tube inside it. And this is the kind of tyre that you will, if you're anything like me, have grown up riding. Sort of being a child of the 90s, that was the standard. If you were that bit older than me, you may have grown up with riding tubular tyres instead. But you have clinchers where you have your tyre that goes over an inner tube, and the inner tube gets pumped up, it inflates the tyre, and if that inner tube gets punctured, then the tyre goes flat. I think that's something we've all experienced. Meanwhile, tubeless tyres, they have no tube inside them. And how they work instead is that they create a vacuum. Well, it's not quite a vacuum, but they the air that you get that's pumped into your tyre is sealed totally inside of the tyre. Now, this is a combination of using the right rim tape and the right tyre and the right valves. But you put some sealant inside this tyre as you do it up. The benefit of the tubeless tyre is that if you get a puncture, then the air gets sucked out of the tyre with the sealant. And as a result, that sealant will then be thrown into this small hole created by the puncture, and fingers crossed, all things being well, assume that it isn't too big and the sealant is of good quality and it doesn't need replacing because it's dried out. That sealant will then fill the hole. Now, you may be riding along and randomly get a little white spray come out of your tyre. That's normal, that's the sealant doing its thing. But it means that you're going to be able to continue with your ride without having to stop and fiddle with a inner tube. This sounds like the best thing ever for many people who are terrified of punctures, and I agree. The argument for using clinchers over tubeless is narrow. There aren't a lot of benefits to it, if I'm honest. Tubeless technology has come on a long way, and it like disc brakes, it is starting to become the industry standard. But it's not all sunshine and roses. You may notice the pattern here. There's very rarely anything in life that comes along that is just outright better than the previous version or incantation. All that it is it's different. It's improved in some ways, but it's more of a pain in others. Now, with tubeless, if you get a puncture, and it's one that the sealant can't seal. Now, this could be because you've let the sealant dry out in your tyre and you've not got round to checking it. And when you get a puncture, the sealant is all dried out and you just get a regular puncture. Alternatively, you could get a puncture that is too big, too wide, too awkward, too long for the sealant to fill. And instead of actually being able to seal that, then all of the air in the sealant just escapes out of the tyre and you're sat there at the side of the road with a big puncture. Now, this obviously is a downside to tubeless, that you can end up stranded, but I recommend that athletes who run tubeless, they take a spare tube with them anyway, and they learn how to insert it into the tyre. Because if you find yourself there at the side of the road with a completely flat tyre and this completely ripped up, this big hole in your tyre, then you can then put in the inner tube and it can get you home. Now, some people can swear off of tubeless tyres and they go, I would never run that, because if you get a puncture that big, then you find yourself stranded. The fact of the matter is, if you get a puncture that tubeless can't realistically seal, there is a decent chance that it would be game over if you're running inner tubes anyway, because it would slash the tyre right open, and as you try to pump up the tube, then there is a chance, if the hole in the tyre is big enough, that the tyre could the inner tube wouldn't be held in place by the tyre and it would start to sort of bulge out of this hole in your tyre and it just wouldn't work anyway. You can get around that by using something like a gel wrapper, such as a boot, by putting it over the hole in the tyre to act as sort of a new inner wall, as it were, for your tyre, so that the inner tube is able to inflate without actually being able to touch the hole. But the fact of the matter is that, it's quite likely that if there is a puncture that took you out of the game running tubeless, there's a good chance it would have taken you out of the game if you're running clinchers anyway. A lot of tyres now are tubeless ready. Around about 6 or 7 years ago, a lot of manufacturers, they could tell which way the wind was blowing. And they made sure the vast majority of their tyres that they released were tubeless ready. And the vast amount of wheels that they sold were also tubeless ready. To give people the option, but also so they didn't end up sort of locking themselves out of this part of the market. And there are some people who are very enthusiastically against anything that could be considered sort of tubeless or these new technologies. They may even still be using tubular wheels, and a tubular wheel, just to explain it to you, a tubular tyre is, rather than having a tyre and an inner tube separately, it comes as one unit. So you take this tyre and you glue your tyre onto your rim, and you then pump it up. Has a valve. You can pump your tyre up, and you then go out and you ride with it. But if you get a puncture whilst riding this, you need to have an entirely new tyre on you. This is a lot to carry around, and you also need to then glue it onto the rim at the side of the road and wait a time for it to set. Honestly, there are arguments that, tubular tyres, maybe they roll ever so slightly better and they feel a little bit nicer. But these positives, they're all based in nostalgia, if you ask me, and the convenience of tubeless and clincher, it's impossible to justify running tubular tyres these days. And as a matter of fact, if you are shopping for bikes and you see a bike that is going really, really cheap, check it doesn't have a tubular tyre, because that is quite likely the reason that it's going so cheap, is that it has tubular tyres and wheels that can only accept tubular tyres. And these are expensive. Nobody's really running them anymore. It's a pain to get hold of. So I recommend you avoid tubular tyres like the plague, and you inquire when buying second-hand bikes just to ensure that you're not picking up anything that's tubular. So I haven't really touched on the chain. And the chain is the heart of the bike in many ways, because without it, you ain't going anywhere. And you need to make sure that you're keeping on top of this chain. But the first thing I want to go over with the chain is that each chain for each different version of a group set or different speeds of bike is individual. So an 11-speed chain will not work on a 12-speed bike, and the same goes for, I think, just about every different chain width out there. Maybe there could be some cross compatibility between 7 and 8. But realistically speaking, with most modern road bikes, when you pick up a new chain, you need to ensure that you are getting the right width chain that is going to work for you. Because if you don't, you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble, because it's going to be too wide, it's not going to sit, it's not going to shift smoothly. So that should be the first thing you're looking at. Whenever you replace a chain, you need to make sure that it matches the one that you've got. Even if it involves taking the bike or the chain itself into the bike shop, they'll be able to have a look at it, and they'll be able to tell you which one it is you need to replace it. Because we need to replace our chain on the regular. This needs to happen very regularly. There's an incredibly important reason for this. Now, when you ride a chain, as you do ride it, it's going to get full of sort of gunk and grease and grit and all of this. It just happens, especially if you are riding in damp conditions. You can go out the door with a sparkling chain and you get back, and you can often see that it's starting to look a little bit black. It's starting to look a bit greasy. If we do not clean this, what will happen is that as we are riding with this chain that we are wearing down with all of this crap, basically, we are going to stretch the chain. And it doesn't have to stretch by much. It is metal at the end of the day. But as that chain starts to stretch, it has a catastrophic impact on the rest of the bike. Now, this is most notable on our chain rings. And these are the teeth on our chain set. So they're right on the front of the bike. And you can often find people will be complaining of suddenly their chain keeps skipping as they pedal. And you can look at their chain set and you can see that all of the teeth on their chain set have gone from having relatively sort of flat heads to those teeth to being quite spiky, looking like shark's teeth. And the reason for this is that the chain has stretched, and as a result, it is wearing away at those rings. Now, to get yourself new chain rings is, it's not cheap, especially if you're having to then pay somebody to install them for you. Equally, the cassette at the back. Now, this doesn't tend to wear quite as quickly because you have, in most cases, 10, 12, 13 gears that the wear can be spread over. But when you have your front chain rings, then you are going to spend, a lot of time with the chain in that position, and it's going to wear away at them. You can go out and get yourself a new chain, but that itself will start to skip and won't shift well because the parts are already worn away. Now, if you are looking to get a new front and rear chainring, and you are looking to get a new rear cassette and a new chain, you're easily looking at 3 figures. It could well be over that. You could be looking at close to about sort of £200, $250, say, for the job. That's a lot of cash. Whereas if you had replaced the chain sooner, none of this would have happened. So how is it that we know when it is that we need to replace our chain? Well, we use a chain checker tool. And this is a tool that we sit within the links of our chain, and we can gauge just how worn the chain is by where sort of the teeth fall. Now, again, this is not a job I'm going to try and explain verbally. It would be confusing and make no sense. But if you go to YouTube or Google and stick in how to use chain checker tool, bicycle maybe, just to make sure that you get the appropriate videos, it will show you how to use it. And the idea is that it will tell you when to replace your chain, and you need to check this about once a month. And when it tells you it's time to replace it, it is time to replace it. Now, you could stay on top of your chain maintenance, and you could be replacing your chain every sort of 6 to 8 months. I don't know, it could be a year in some cases, depending on how much you ride your bike. You could keep on top of this job, and you will still wear down your cassette and your chain rings because it's metal on metal. No matter how well we lubricate it, it is going to wear down. So it is inevitable that you will wear them down and you'll damage them, but by looking after our chain, by replacing it on the regular, that is going to make a huge difference. But the most important thing that we can do with this to avoid having to replace our chain as well as checking it is to clean it. And a lot of bike maintenance comes down to cleaning. And that's kind of boring. Let's be honest, nobody enjoys cleaning their bike. Well, I imagine some people might. But to actually have to put all of that time and that energy into relatively mundane jobs, yeah, it's not exciting. When you get back from a ride, having to, after you have had a shower and changed, to go out and to wipe your chain down. Or if it's been wet, to get the degreaser out. Spray degreaser on the chain, making sure that you avoid anywhere that has bearings, which I'll touch on in a minute. But you need to degrease that chain and then wipe it down and then clean it to keep it in pristine condition. If you ride it when the chain is looking black and horrible, you're going to chew through expensive components so fast. And this is something that I think, a lot of people who have good money, who might spend, significant amounts of cash on their bike, get this really expensive group set, they've gone for the Dura Ace, they've paid the premium, but they don't look after their bike. And they take it into a bike shop and the mechanic goes, yeah, based on the components that we'd have to replace, if you want Dura Ace components, we're looking at around about a £1,500 repair bill, if not more. Which could have been avoided if they'd have just cleaned their chain and checked the length of it and replaced it when necessary. So it's hard to overemphasize how important cleaning your chain and replacing it after, when it needs replacing really is critical. Now, it's not just the chain that we need to clean, it's all other areas of the bike. I mean, firstly, there's the areas that the chain touches. So that's your chain rings, that's your cassette. You've also got the frame itself. Now, that's mainly cosmetic, I'll be honest. But still, we don't want to be riding around on a visibly dirty bike. Your cables, if you have, especially if there are cables that are externally routed at points, that means that the cables can end up, collecting dirt and that on their own. You may need to take them out, strip them, clean them, lubricate them again. Whereas if a cable is completely or largely at least within the internals of the frame, it should be an awful lot easier. If you look at the cogs on the jockey wheels, so if you look at your rear mech or your rear derailleur, you'll see there are 2 wheels that are in there. They can really attract gunk in themselves, and when you are cleaning your chain, then you do want to make sure that you give them a wipe as well. These are all really, important jobs to keep on top of, and it saves you a lot of money. a lot of stress in the long run. I mean, I've had it before where I didn't keep on top of this, and then I had a 100-mile sportive, and I think the day before the ride, my chain started skipping because the chain rings were worn, and I really had to stress and rush to find a new chain set, a new chain, new cassette, get all this installed. If I'd have just kept on top of my maintenance, I wouldn't have to worry about it. I also want to touch on bearings because these need to be maintained, these need to be replaced. Now, I'm just going to make it really simple here for people who aren't aware of such things. So bearings, they will sit inside what's called a race, which will simply be, a circular area that will be sitting over something such as your bottom bracket or your headset or the hubs of your wheels. Basically, wherever there is going to be something that's going to be moving, there's probably going to be some bearings involved. And these bearings, they're often steel ball bearings, but they can be ceramic bearings in some cases. They are there and they are lubricated or treated with something that allows them to move very smoothly. If you don't have bearings, or the bearings are worn or they haven't been looked after, then instead of having something that's going to turn smoothly, as you sort of turn the headset, so the headset is what your handlebars are attached to the bike with. Basically, it's that bit there. If this isn't looked after well, then when you steer the bike, it's going to feel gritty. Whereas if you have bearings that are looked after well, it's going to be much smoother. When we start looking at the bearings in our wheels, these are quite difficult to access. These are a bit of a faff. But again, if you have bearings that are not looked after well, there's going to be additional friction through those wheels. And when you have friction in your wheels, you are losing power, you are losing performance because you're really working against that sort of all of the dirt, all of the grit inside that race of bearings there. So what we do is we make sure that we are cleaning bearings, we're making sure that we're replacing them when needs be. Even if you look after bearings to the very best of your ability, over time they are going to start to wear the race down ever so slightly, and this can impact performance. But if you're listening to this, chances are this all sounds like gobbledygook, and you're like, I wouldn't even know where to begin with this. But bearings, honestly, they are something that I recommend that most cyclists leave until they put their bike in for a service. Now, I would recommend a service twice a year. The first service is after the winter. So in around, it depends on sort of where you live as to which month is winter, but in the northern hemisphere, for most countries, probably going to be looking at something around kind of March or April time, when every ride isn't going to be quite as wet, quite as gritty and greasy on the roads, when you're going to be doing much more in the way of fair weather riding. Put your bike in for a service. And this should be your the gold service. This should be the top level of service that your bike shop provides. You often have like a bronze, a silver and a gold service, where a bronze service, they may just be indexing your gears, checking your spokes. This is the kind of job that may only take a mechanic around about 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. Depends on the bike, depends how much needs to be done. But it really is sort of the bare minimum. Lubricate the chain, give it a clean, check all of, everything's working as it should be, everything's indexed nicely. It is just a little light touch. And honestly, most of the jobs that are done in a bronze service, most people could learn to do at home themselves. It may involve also actually replacing sealant if you have tubeless wheels. Now, then you have a silver service, which is where they will look much more at things such as sort of your bearings. They'll look at check different areas for wear, and they'll go that extra level. They will go through and give everything like a thorough degrease, a proper clean, a tune-up. It really is, a much better level of service. But the gold service, this is normally something that will take a mechanic several hours, and you will be paying a premium for this. But they will almost take your bike apart, replace the bearings, give everything a deep clean, and you'll have it feeling like new when you come out of that service. Now, the price that you're quoted does not include any, that just covers the labour. That doesn't cover any additional parts. And you may, I mean, it's like dropping your car off for a service. They may ask for pre-authorization for things such as, bearings and cables and simple basic things like that, hydraulic fluid maybe. But this gold service, it really is worth having done once a year. If you're putting on the kind of mileage that you will be when training for triathlon, you want to make sure that your bike is not going to fail on you. You want to make sure that it is going into race day, and the rest of your training, getting ready for summer in the best condition possible. And the second service of the year I recommend that you get is about a week or two out from race day. Now, if you have a really big event such as an Ironman or a 70.3, or you're going to a championship event, then I really want you to get your bike serviced 1 or 2 weeks out. Now, the reason I say 1 or 2 weeks out, as opposed to say, sort of a few days out, is that mechanics are human. Mechanics make mistakes. And the last thing that you want is to drop your bike off for a service, pick up the day before the race, and it just isn't working the way that it should. And it's, I know it myself when I work on bikes, I've chatted to mechanics about this. Gears that shift perfectly in the work stand, sometimes you take the bike off of the work stand and you ride it outside and it doesn't work quite the same. Which is why when I worked at a bike shop, you'd often see the mechanics go outside and they would ride the bike around the block, take it through the gears, check that it actually works well on the road. Even if they do this, there is still the chance that something couldn't quite be tight enough. I dropped my bike off, had some work done on it, and the gear changes were just a little bit like rattly. And I took it off, I've got all my own tools at home, but I just needed help installing this component. And I realised that the cassette, it wasn't done up properly, and I just gave it another like 1/8 of a turn. It didn't need tightening up that much, but there's still some give on there. Tightened it up that little bit more, and it was solved. But a lot of people, they don't have this knowledge, they don't have the tools at home. So by getting it done a week or two out, you can then go and do your last few rides on it. And if it is not quite working the way it should be, then that will give you enough time to take it back to the shop and go, hey, can you have another look at this because it's not feeling how it should. Now, it should be pointed out at this point, there is a bit of a bell curve when it comes to the amount of time and money that it spends to look after a bike. Now, if you get a really cheap bike, if you get one from Halfords or Walmart or somewhere, Argos, something really cheap, it is going to take actually a surprising amount of time and money to repair it because the parts are going to fail left, right and centre. They're just not designed for repeated use, which is why I try to put people off of getting these cheap bikes, because it can end up costing you more in the long run. If you get yourself a nice, decent quality road bike, if you get yourself some good quality sort of Shimano components, they should look after themselves for a long, long time. But if you then start looking at much more expensive bikes, these are going to require more in the way of care and attention. If you have a proper triathlon bike, which, involves the TT bars, that has the base bar, where everything is set up to be more specific and aerodynamic, these can be a real nightmare to work on. And you'll actually often pay a premium to get these serviced because of how complex they are. I'm pretty good with bikes. I could strip my road bike down to the absolute frame and rebuild it up into a working bike within 3 or 4 hours, I'd like to think. Depending on how long it takes me to do things. I'm not a professional mechanic, but I can still look after it. When it comes to my triathlon bike, though, sending it straight to the bike shop. There is so much that can go wrong there that I'm just not willing to risk it. So you do need to sort of keep this into consideration when you are looking at your bike. Additionally, as I touched on, the more expensive components are, the more expensive they are to replace if and when they wear out and they fail. And that realistically is, you need to keep that in mind when you are budgeting, when you're buying a bike, knowing that, even if, especially if you look like ceramic bearings and the like, that these components, they do cost more. It's not just a one-off cost. It's like buying a Ferrari. You're going to spend more to service your Ferrari than most people would spend on a car. So keep this in mind when you are purchasing a bike. Now I'm going to touch on some nuts and bolts here. Bits that are really important to know, some roadside mechanical bits as well as general tips. The first is knowing how to fix a drop chain. Now, as I touched on previously, limit screws, they limit how much a chain can move, but sometimes they go wrong for whatever reason. It happens to professional racers sometimes. The reason for it is generally somebody who is shifting under load. So if somebody is pushing, working really hard, pedaling fast, and they then make a shift, this makes it far more likely that you're going to drop a chain. If it happens repeatedly, it is the limit screws. If it just happens very occasionally, chances are it's a mixture of that and possibly just some bad luck thrown in as well. You can get chain catchers, which are a little bit that you can attach to your bike frame, which should prevent the chain from falling off. But you know, I'm not going to advise on those because I don't know too much about them. But you can Google them if you're interested. Now, this as a problem to fix is actually really quite simple, because all you need to do is whenever the chain drops, is you need to peel it out with your fingers. And yes, your fingers are going to get mucky here. This is another reason to keep your chain clean. You're going to pull the chain out and you're going to loop it back around your chain rings, because it's normally at the front that it falls off. Again, the same goes for if it falls off of the cassette. You just need to retrieve it and loop it back around. Now, this can be easier said than done, because quite often you can find yourself with the chain kind of wrapped around itself and to make itself a little bit of a knot. So you do need a little bit of patience here. And, you do just need to accept, look, I'm going to have to get my fingers mucky. It's just part of cycling. And again, if it happens regularly, take it into a bike shop, get them to have a look at it, see if you can play around with the limit screws, or if you're feeling brave, find a video on YouTube that tells you how to set up your limit screws yourself. Next up, let's look at how to fix a puncture, or how to change a tube, I should say. Now, the first thing we need to do is we need to remove the rear wheel. And this is a job that a lot of people get freaked out by. They try to remove the wheel and they get themselves into all sorts of trouble. Quickest way to get it out, and the simplest way, is to make sure that before you undo anything, that you change gears so that you move your chain so it's all the way down in the smallest chain ring on the cassette on the back of your bike. This will make it an awful lot easier to help remove and replace your rear wheel. Once you are in where your the gear is on the front ring or the small ring at the front, doesn't really matter, as long as it's in the smallest gear at the back. Once you're at that point, either undo the quick release or the through axle, depending on the bike that you're using, and your rear wheel should drop out. You may need to push the cage of the rear mech back slightly, just to allow that to drop out nice and easily. Once you have the rear wheel out, you will assume that your tyre is already flat, which it probably will be at this point. You need to get some tyre levers out of your saddlebag, and I do recommend that somebody carries around a couple of tyre levers with them. And you will jam one of these tyre levers under the bead of the tyre. That will create a gap, and then you stick the second tyre lever in the gap that's created, and you drag it to the right or to the left, which will kind of open up the tyre and remove it from the rim. At this point, pull the tyre off and remove the inner tube as well. Stick that to one side. I would stick the inner tube straight in my pocket. I'll take that one home. But when you have the tyre off of the wheel, run your finger lightly around the inside of the tyre to check for any sharp objects, because it's not always clear what it is that's caused the puncture. Now, if you look at the inner tube, you may see a couple of vertical lines that are running down, that are sort of holes, I should say, rather than lines. That means it's a snake bite puncture, which you get when your bike is, it hits a pothole, but the pressure of the tyre is too low, which means the rim will pinch the inner tube against the road, and it will cause a puncture that way. So there's been no sharp objects. That was an issue with low tyre pressure. The majority of punctures, however, are caused by sharp objects which are making their way through the tyre. And you need to make sure that you remove those sharp objects before you put the new inner tube in. because otherwise what's going to happen is that you could put that fresh inner tube back in, pump it straight back up, and you get another puncture within seconds because there is still a sharp bit of metal or flint or something sticking through the tyre. Next up, you put the tyre half on the rim. So you put one of the tyre beads back around the rim of the bike. It shouldn't be overly difficult. And then you take the inner tube, you just put a couple of pumps of air in using your mini pump, just to give it a bit of shape, and then you pop that in, make sure that you align the valve with sort of the hole the valve sits in, and then you will, once your inner tube is seated properly within the tyre, you will then close the bead of the tyre fully by wrapping it all around and sort of tightening it all up. This can get really difficult by the time that you get to the end. When you start off putting your sort of the second tyre bead on, it will go in quite easily. But the closer you get to sort of the other end of the tyre that you started, the more difficult it's going to be. And there are a few tips and tricks you can use, but I will leave YouTube to teach you those. Though that is the basic principles of repairing a puncture, it can require more in the way of grip and upper body strength than you might think in some cases, but most people, able-bodied people, will still be capable of doing it. And even if you can't, it's worth carrying the spares so that some strapping young lad who'll be out on a ride and spots you at the side of the road could stop and could help you with your bike. And the last job we're going to talk you through is degreasing and cleaning your chain, because it's such an integral one that I've talked about. What you do is you wash your chain with water. Now, if you are going to clean your bike, I recommend that you do your chain before the rest of your bike, because if you have a lovely clean bike frame and then you start getting the degreaser out and there's grease everywhere, you are going to get that on the frame. It's inevitable, and you're then going to have to rewash the frame. So to start with, we wipe down the chain with some kind of sort of kitchen roll or a cloth, a rag, something like that. Run it through, I tend to sort of hold the rag over the chain relatively tightly and then spin the pedals repeatedly for 30 seconds or something, just to get as much gunk off manually as I can. I'll then give it a rinse with water. If it's especially bad, I might spray on some bike cleaner actually first to get the worst of it off. But you then wash it down with water. So by this point, the actual outside of the chain should look an awful lot better. But we need to degrease the chain to get rid of all of the gunk that has attracted itself to it. Now, there are two ways to do this. Either use a spray bottle and you're very careful about where you spray this, or you can use a chain bath. And whichever you use is up to you. I used a chain bath in days gone by, but I found that the amount of degrease that I needed to fill the chain bath with was quite significant. It got quite expensive, and in the end I just became really careful. I just got my bike up on the work stand in my garden. I was just very careful with how I sprayed the degreaser onto the chain, and avoiding anywhere that has bearings. So that is the bottom bracket, the cranks, and that is the hubs and the rear derailleur. As long as you're very careful with where you spray on the degreaser, you should probably be okay. And you let that sit for the amount of time that is directed on the bottle. And then once it has finished that, then you probably go through and you'll give it another wipe down. That will then have your chain degreased. Then you go and you wash the rest of the bike, the frame, the components, everything like that, with just general bike cleaner. Spray it on, follow the instructions. It's really quite easy to clean a bike. But what's critical, once we have degreased our chain and the rest of it is looking nice, is to re-lube our chain. Because if we don't have lubricant in our chain, it is going to sound god-awful. If you ever have somebody cycle past you and it sounds like an agricultural vehicle, sorry, I know that's a terrible impression. But then the chances are they just haven't used enough lubricant. So you then, with your bike still on the work stand or still stood up wherever it is, you will then drop some lubricant on the chain. You don't need much. Now you get two types of lube. You get wet lube and you get dry lube. In the UK, I recommend everybody uses wet lube. Except for maybe at times like this during a heat wave where there is like no rain forecast, the roads are completely dry, we might be able to get away with dry lube. But for a good like 10-11 months of the year, always have wet lube, because if it starts raining out of nowhere, which has been known to happen in the UK or most of Europe, to be honest, that dry lube is going to wash right off, and your chain is going to start to become really inefficient and it's going to sound awful. Whereas wet lube, it does require a bit more cleaning, it does attract more in the way of mess, but it will stay attached to your chain in all weathers. So that would be my recommendation there. Some people, they go for ceramic lube, some people might wax their chains. I'm not going to get into that here. You'll hear people talk about that. You can do a bit of research in your own time. Personally, I just used old-fashioned bike lube. And when you apply that bike lube, again, pedal the bike, send it through all of the gears, really make sure that you're sending that bike lube around the entirety of the bike chain. And then after that, wipe the excess lube off of the chain, because if you leave the lube on there, that is going to attract dirt. So you wipe it off and you're just leaving that lubricant between the links of the chain. That's just where it needs to be. It needs to be within the links of the chain. It doesn't need to be anywhere else. And you should look at your chain, you should go, oh, that looks really nice and it feels so much smoother to pedal now. And it's just a job that we need to keep on top of year round, making sure we're looking after our chain, because that will look after the rest of our bike. So I wanted to round this off with what I think is probably the most, well, not the most important, but one of the most important maintenance tips. And that is regarding a magic piece of equipment known as a torque wrench. Now, I talked in the first part of this series about carbon fibre and how it's an incredibly strong material, but if you clamp it, it can suddenly become quite fragile because it's not designed to be moved in that way. When we are attaching components or tightening things up on our bike, we need to pay careful attention to the amount of torque that we are applying. Because if we don't apply enough torque when we change our saddle height and we tighten the clamp back up, the seat post clamp, if we have it too loose, then as we're riding along, the saddle is going to drop. It's just gravity. Whereas if we do it up too tight, we can tighten, crack, and you've just ruined your bike. So how do we avoid this? We avoid this with a wonderful tool known as a torque wrench. And these aren't the most expensive tools in the world. You can be looking at around about £50, I think, for a torque wrench. Maybe, depends on the one that you go for. But if you're going to be doing maintenance at home, if you're going to be installing components, if you're going to be changing your saddle height, you really should get yourself a torque wrench. Because when you look at the seat post clamp and it goes maximum 7 Newton meters, you set your torque wrench to say like 6.5, because you don't always need to go to the max. You tighten it up and the torque wrench will let you know when you've reached that limit. Again, sometimes it will make a noise, sometimes the handle will stop working, it depends on the model. But it's really important that we acknowledge this and that we get ourselves a torque wrench to avoid breaking our bike. It's a bit of an essential. Speaking of tightening things, actually, one thing that I wanted to touch on is wheels. Now, when I got my first tool set for my bike, you can get, if you go online, you can get quite a reasonably priced tool set where you get all the basics that you need. So you can get some large workshop level tyre levers. You can get all sorts of large Allen keys for use in a workshop. You can get bottom bracket extraction tools. You can get a cassette tool. You can get a chain whip. You can get all of these odd tools that you only ever really use on a bike, many of them, but you get it all for a really good price relative to buying them all individually. And I remember I got my spoke key, and I remember having a look at it and realised, oh, hang on a minute, I can still tighten up some of these spokes. Now, I know that some people listen to this with their heads in their hands and go, you idiot. And I agree. Yes, Simon, you idiot. And I'm trying to prevent you from falling down this same hole. Now, everything on a bike should be pretty tight. There should be nothing that is remotely loose. But spokes, you should be able to tighten and you should be able to loosen them. Do not touch them unless you know exactly what it is that you're doing. The reason is that the spokes hold a very specific amount of tension in them. So you have if you look at the spokes, they will have, one will be on the outside of the wheel, one will be on the inside of the wheel, and they'll alternate. And if your wheel buckles, if your wheel ends up, where you end up with the wheel would rub your rim brake, or it just, as you spin the wheel, you can see that it's wobbling a bit from side to side. That's normally because you have hit a pothole, your rim has bent, and your spokes, as a result, will be thrown out. Now, if you tighten the appropriate spoke, that can bend the wheel back into shape. If you start tightening up spokes, you are, without knowing what you're doing, the chances of you completely throwing your wheel out of balance are extremely high. So my recommendation is, don't touch the spokes of your bike. It's something that I don't feel super confident doing myself, because I know the chance of me making it worse are really quite high. So what sort of a good maintenance job to do is, when you are every now and then, especially when you're putting in big miles on the bike, just give each of your spokes just a little bit of a shake. And if you feel one rattling around and it's visibly loose, if you start patting all the spokes, if you feel that one's visibly loose, that one does need tightening up. You can probably do that one up yourself with a spoke key until it looks a bit better, but equally it may be something you want to send your bike to the shop for them to have a look at. The more expensive a wheel is, the less spokes there will be on the wheel, and as a result, the more likely it will be to be thrown out of true and to need correcting. Just something to consider. Now, the mechanical side of cycling, fixing your bike, looking after, it's a big topic. And there are some good books out there that I recommend that you look at if you're into this, because it is an important skill for you to learn if you're going to be out riding bikes in the middle of nowhere, be able to fix them on the fly, having the tools, having the knowledge. It's incredibly important. And if your bike breaks on race day, if you have the knowledge to get yourself going again within a few minutes, that is going to make a massive difference. Somebody just be able to know that, my bike is stuck in the big ring, but I know that if I undo the screw for the cable that is sort of keeping the front mech there, then the tension is going to disappear completely and it will put me into my small ring. Just knowing things like this can really get you out of a tight spot. So I heavily recommend that you continue education, watch some more YouTube videos. Again, there's only so much that I can do via podcast. Do some more reading and really try to understand this, because it is really important for you to be able to, achieve your goals and feel confident as a triathlete rather than an imposter riding a bike. Hope you found that useful. Next week, I'm going to be doing part 3. Which is going to be hopefully a little lighter than that was, where I'm going to be looking at clothing, the kind of clothing that you might want to be wearing and the benefits of it, getting a bike fit, getting a bike set up for you, as well as basic principles of training. So, hope you found that useful, and I will see you all next week for part 3. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't done already. Take care, and wishing the very best of luck with your week of training ahead.